Hello and welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. I'm your host, Mark Philpott. Now, if you're a regular listener, welcome back and thank you very much for your loyalty. If this is your first time visiting the show, I'm very pleased that you found us, and you can check out all of our previous episodes by going to www.globaltravelchannel.com. This month, we're playing Dial a Friend at the Global Travel Channel, so that means every one of my listeners is challenged with the task of telling one person about this incredible podcast show. If you do that, it'll be greatly appreciated. Okay, on with today's show. My guest has traveled to over 70 countries around the world. He is a self-confessed international man of mystery. In his own words, he lives a dual existence. Let's find out all about that and more by welcoming to the Global Travel Channel podcast show, Mr. John Hamalian. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark.
Great speaking with you again. Whereabouts in the world are you today?
I'm in my base of Singapore, which is where we know each other from. And it's been a few years since we've seen each other face to face. But I'm here. I'll be heading home for Christmas soon.
Fantastic. And how's lovely Singapore these days? It's been a while since I've been there and I miss the place.
Yeah, we miss you here. It's in the middle of the monsoon season, so it's been raining quite a lot. And luckily today we've got a break, so it's pretty nice and sunny.
Singapore's a place where you've been living for a little while. You've also lived in a number of other places. How do you find living in Singapore?
I really like it here. It's a great place to be based, and of course, a lot of us travel a lot, so we will be all over the place. But it's very convenient to come in and out of Singapore, and it's also a well-run place, so things work. It's a great place to open up a business. The taxes are reasonable. And it's just overall a pretty pleasant place to live if you can afford the housing. The housing costs are the biggest really consideration for living here, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But overall, there's a lot of fine positive points about the wonderful island of Singapore.
Yes. Lee Kuan Yew, the founder, used to say that Singapore has to punch above its weight. So they always have to really outlive or outsize its relatively small size. And I think they do that pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, have you done many podcasts before?
This is my first one, Mark.
Oh, surprisingly, a man that's traveled the world so much and been in the press so much, I would have thought that you would have done more than one podcast before.
Well, as I think you know, I'm more of a writer. So I tend to type more than I speak, although I do have spoken at quite a lot of conferences, but just never really did a podcast. I did a webinar once, but this would be my first podcast, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, I'm honored that I get the opportunity to have you on my show as your first podcast, and I hope you enjoy the ride with us today. We'll find out at the end whether you did or not.
Yes, we will.
Now, what I usually do with my guests is I give you the opportunity to actually dedicate your show to someone special in your life. Who would you like to dedicate this podcast show to today?
Oh, wow, what an honor. I would have to dedicate it to my family, particularly my parents. Without them, I wouldn't be here. And I'm pretty fortunate that I still have both my mother and my father. And they've been, really my formative years. They were the ones that really, I think, made me who I am, as well as my sister and my nephew. That's my close family.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's a lovely dedication. I'm sure they'll be very appreciative of that. Actually, we're going to start off there with your background because you're an Armenian American, and that's quite it's not a typical mix, is it? So tell us about your roots and growing up, where that was and how all that unfolded for you.
Yeah, there is the biggest population of Armenians in America is in the Los Angeles region. So for me, we grew up on the East Coast. There's a sizable communities of Armenians there as well. And my grandparents all came from what was the Ottoman Empire. the lands that are now the Republic of Turkey. So they had come from that part of the world, and my parents were the first generation born in America, and came over with very little and had to work their way, typical American story, American immigration story, working their way up from not having much and working very hard to establish themselves. And that's another thing that I'm pretty proud of, as descendants of immigrants, as well as a population of people. The Armenians are, if at best, we're 10 million in the entire world, so it's a pretty small ethnic group. But yet somehow you'll end up meeting one, just like you met me in Singapore. We pop up out of nowhere.
Actually, it's funny you say that, because just in the last couple of days, I've also met somebody else from Armenia just out of the blue as well. So that's exactly correct what you just said.
Yeah.
So how old were you when you had your first international travel experience? Was that when you were in the US?
I did take a European trip with with some of my buddies when we were in our 20s, and that was a blast. That was like a couple of weeks all around Europe, and one of the most fun trips I think any of us have ever taken. But I think the big trip for me was the first time I went to China for work, when I was in General Motors, and that was in the middle 90s, and that was the trip that I think that really opened up my eyes to the world.
Going to China as one of your first experiences, particularly when you're doing it from a work position, I guess is something different as well, isn't it?
Yes, it does feel different when you're not going on a holiday. And for us in that team, it was all a new experience. So we all, started taking that journey together, and it was an adventure. Even though we were there for work, it felt like an adventure.
What were some of your first recollections of China during that trip?
This was Shanghai, and it was probably in the middle of its developmental cycle. And now you go to Shanghai, and it's just an amazing, glitzy city, tall buildings everywhere. There was just a few tall buildings back then. The airport that everybody knows now was not there at all. And what's now known as the sort of more of the local airport in Hongqiao, that's the one that we flew into. And I remember going in at night, and there was no street lamps. So the only it was pitch black in the middle of the night, and the only light that you could see was the little bit of light coming from the headlamps from our taxi cab.
Wow.
And that's one thing I just sort of remember. You go there now, and of course it's all bright and brand new highways, and it's just been such a remarkable change. I've been to China every year since then for about 25 years now, consistently, and seeing the change, it's just really exhilarating.
That's a fantastic memory to have, because I don't think there'd be many people listening to the show today who have actually been to China when there were no streetlights, and that was in the years where just before, I guess, all the industrialization and the pace of change really started in China to what many of us know of it today.
Absolutely, yes.
What did that trip to China make you realize about the world? Going to China to do business from the United States, how did it open up your eyes on first of all, doing work around the world, doing business around the world, but also just in relation to other cultures? What were some of your first impressions from that?
It was really discovering, wow, there's a whole nother world out there. And of course you can read it in textbooks, and being growing up in the New York area, I grew up with Chinese Americans, a lot of friends of Chinese descent, and Chinese culture, Chinatown, everybody would know all these things. But to actually go there and really experience it and talk to people and in a way, there was this innocence there that because it hadn't been too long since really the Mao years, where it was a very conservative society. No one dressed in any colors. It was all, that sort of a bit of a gray colored place. The way the buildings were, the way people dressed, but very spirited people. And so I think one of the things I learned was the stereotypes that you grow up with, they really don't apply, and to apply broad brush generalizations and stereotypes to either countries or people or religions, it all went out the window as soon as I got to, actually spend some time on the ground and really talking to people was I think my biggest lesson. And that kind of translates a little bit into business as well, right? Because we also have stereotypes that seep into the business world.
How did you find doing business there for the first time? That must have been a huge culture shock from a business perspective as well, because the Chinese do business in a very specific way. How did you deal with that? Was that something that took a while to get used to and adapt to?
We were, I guess, in a way, kind of, since we were employees of a big company and we were there to help set up a new operation, actually a whole new factory, and the very first foundation of General Motors in China, and now they're one of the largest. Back then, it was literally an empty field. So we didn't really have to do the business, sort of wheeling and dealing, because we were managers and engineers assigned to get a project up and running. But I think getting to know the people that we worked with and establishing relationships, which is it is in a way a Chinese way of doing business, but it's also just makes it fun and enjoyable. So we were able to establish those relationships, get to know guys. We would go out all the time. We really had a lot of fun. It was probably the most fun and challenging project I've ever been on.
It's quite an iconic footprint when you think about it, because here you are representing General Motors, United States of America, going into the heartland of China and setting up a business. That must have been, something quite phenomenal to be part of at the time.
It really was. We probably didn't realize it at the time, because you never really do while you're in it. But then you look back and you say, we're really part of that first movement. And I still remember the first meeting we had when it was the folks from our Chinese company counterpart, which was Shanghai Auto Company, and General Motors, and they had translators. And the first time that we were all sitting down and looking at each other like wow, like two worlds just came together here. And the first time I heard a translator, and recognizing that, we really don't all speak the same language, but when it comes down to deciphering what people are thinking, and people are really the same no matter where you go. But that first meeting was something where it really starts hitting you that these are two different worlds coming together for the first time. And then I got used to it after that. But I still remember that one with those translators there, and thinking, that even just a basic thing like language, we have to work around. And it's so easy to be miscommunicated a point. It's hard to communicate and very easy to miscommunicate. So you have to really be careful and not let things get taken out of context.
It's a really good point. And I think in terms of anybody who's traveled anywhere in the world, that association through language is such a groundbreaker. If you're able to speak another person's language, it just can open up so many doors so much more rapidly. But we're going to get into that. Now, I should have mentioned to you at the beginning of the show that I've started a new kind of game with my guests, if you like, and I'm calling it the guest pop quiz. So throughout the episode today, I'm going to be throwing pop quiz questions at you, just fast 5-second questions that are going to keep you on your toes, asking you about all sorts of crazy stuff to do with travel. So whenever I say time for a pop quiz question, you know what's coming, and you just give me your answer to what I'm about to ask, okay? I was really excited to have you on the show, John, because first of all, you call yourself the global man. You've traveled to more than 70 countries around the world. And I think somebody who's traveled so much has a very good, not only appetite for travel, but also understanding of other cultures and that. So one of the first things I wanted to know from you is what's really fueled your hunger for travel over the years? Has there been a central reason why you love traveling so much?
It's a great question. I never really would have thought that I'd be a traveler. And I think going to China, of course, opened up the door. And that was maybe thanks to General Motors that really allowed that to happen, created a mechanism for me to get to the other side of the world. And then something else happened, though. In Shanghai, there was one of my colleagues, another American. He was a real adventurer. He would be the guy to ride a motorbike across Southeast Asia. He would go across like Vietnam and Laos. And this was in the 80s, in the 90s that he would do stuff like that.
Mm.
And so he says to me, "Hey John, I'm going to go to Cambodia. You want to come along?" And this is the late 90s. You know, Pol Pot hadn't been dead for that long, and you know, all you ever heard about Cambodia was sort of dark things.
Mm.
You know, the genocide and everything. So I said, you know, I don't know. He goes, "Well, you know, I'm going. Either you're in or you're out. You know, make up your mind." I said, all right, I'll go. What the heck? And that was another trip that really opened up the gates, I think, because that one really felt like an adventure, because we didn't really have an itinerary. We just went there. I don't even think we knew what Angkor Wat was.
Mm.
We saw a picture and we said, we got to go there. We took a boat across the lake to get there. I'm not even sure if there was an airport at that time near Angkor Wat and Siem Reap. And I think that's the one that gave me the travel bug, because I also started taking notes and sending it to family and friends. And then a lady had picked up on it and said a few years later, said, "I think you should write for this magazine because they're looking for an international writer on the travel section." So the combination of then getting a passion for writing also fed into the travel. So the two became kind of a symbiotic partnership of wanting to travel more, then write more, then travel more and write more.
Obviously, did it give you an appetite to be more adventurous in the way that you traveled in the future?
Yes, I think so. What I realized was those ones were the most fun and the most interesting. And I would take maybe a normal trip as well, like go to a big city like Tokyo or Bangkok and have a relatively sort of a normal trip. But then I would always be itching for that more adventurous trip to some place that most people don't go to.
Mm.
So it became a yearning.
Mm. Mm. That's cool. Now, I'm quite curious about finding out about the mentality of certain nationalities when it comes to travel. And you're somebody that's lived in a number of countries, being the United States, China, Korea, and Singapore now. How have you found the mentality of people in those countries when it comes to travel? Because I think in terms of, sometimes we look at countries and we generalize about the population. We say, oh, you know, they're usually a group of well-traveled people and they know the world, and every time you talk to somebody, they're off on another trip. But then there's those countries around the world where people aren't normally very well traveled, and some people don't even have passports and all the rest of it. So from the countries that you've actually lived in, what have been the mentalities of the people of those countries when it comes to traveling?
Yeah, that's also an interesting question. You can see they go through a transition. Maybe it's related to the developmental curve, maybe not. You could tell that the Chinese tourists, for example, in China, it used to be they would always go in group tours.
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of them didn't have the means to travel, and if they did, either for economic reasons or in some cases, the countries that hosted them would not allow Chinese individual travelers. So they would almost go, if they traveled at all, they would go in big groups.
Yeah.
And even inside China. So I went to Tibet. I was the only Westerner to be on this whole busload full of local tourists. So that's the way they would usually go. But now you were already seeing the independent China traveler starting to make their mark, where people they've maybe got a little bit more money, and also they're more free to travel, and they're starting to travel alone and have a more of a yearning for exotic destinations, and that's also happening now in Singapore, where generally speaking, probably most Singaporeans would say that they're a little more conservative in their travels. They would go to established places like Tokyo, for example, or London or New York. And now I just came literally across a few people in the last month that have been to Everest, all Singaporeans. And I'm guessing you probably wouldn't have seen that too much even just 10, 15, and 20 years ago. So it's an evolution, I think.
How about when you lived in Korea? You lived in Korea for a while. What were the Koreans like when it came to travel? I see this year they've just been announced as the #1 nationality of travelers in the world.
The ones that are going out traveling?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also pretty interesting because they were considered this, the so-called the Hermit Kingdom, right? Collectively, which now we call really North Korea. But even in the South, up until the 2000s, even they themselves were a little bit off the grid, and they went through this whole awakening of establishing themselves to the world. And then I think the next step was for them to then see the world. And were isolated for so long. I think that they were probably just bursting to want to engage with the rest of the world. But I had no idea that they were like the #1 like that. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, surprised me as well. Okay, I've got your first pop quiz of the episode, and your first pop quiz question is JFK or Chicago O'Hare?
Well, I fly into JFK, so that's probably the airport that I know the best when I come home. So I always go through Tokyo and into JFK.
Okay, we'll take JFK as your answer on that one then.
Generally, I'd probably, from the few times and the people that I talked to, I would probably second that motion. Try to avoid maybe Chicago there.
So out of the countries that I just mentioned where you've lived, being the United States, China, Korea, and Singapore, do you have a preference on which one you prefer in terms of living? Which is, of course, very different to traveling to as a tourist. So where have you felt more comfortable or more excited to be living in out of those countries where you have so far?
Yes, they... like everything in life, there's always pros and cons. Every place has a charm, and then something that you'd love to be a little bit different. I still look back at my days in Shanghai as some of my happier days. I think it was also the work was great, and I was a little younger and was going out and having a good time. The project was interesting, so that all collectively, you have fond memories of a place. So I loved Shanghai and you go back now and it's still really the same. It's dynamic, there's a lot of energy, but of course also just a lot of people. So if you don't like congested places, Shanghai is definitely not going to be for you. And Seoul was also a very interesting place, and I really loved living there. I used to be able to jog up to the Seoul Tower, up on the hill that dominates the landscape there, the cityscape. I think the things about North Asia. So when I was in Korea and China, was just more personal preferences. I learned to not be very good with the cold. So the winters there can really just be brutal. So one of the things of many things I like about Singapore is there is no winter.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So in a way, I've been escaping the cold, and I even my whole travel schedule is based around staying in Singapore when most of the world is warm, and when most of the world is cold, and then when most of the world is warm, that's when I tend to do most of my travels.
Yeah, that's very smart traveling. I was just going to add, the only time I remember being cold in Singapore is when I used to have to wear my ski jacket into the movie theaters to beat the air conditioning process there.
Oh yeah, we say here there's two seasons in Singapore, is summer outside and winter inside.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Now, I'm interested to know, since you started traveling way back in the day, has your approach to the way that you travel changed over the years?
In terms of the places that I would go to, or more the way that I would travel?
More the way that you would travel. Do you think you've become a smarter traveler now based on all your experiences? And if so, what are some of the things that you've maybe changed or adapted to become a smarter traveler?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like a lot of things, we do become a little smarter with time, and maybe a little bit more conservative. So probably would have taken a little bit more risk back when we were a little bit younger. I'm probably more selective where I go now. And part of it will be, for example, the last bigger trip I went to was Peru. The reason I went there was because I had a business trip to Brazil. So maybe part of it would be being patient, and instead of jumping to Peru, I waited for the right opportunity where I was going to be in that area anyway. And perhaps there's a little bit more of a strategy around my trips now, because I would like to finish Asia. I've only got a few countries left, so I would tend to select the countries also based on sort of where I want to finish part of the world, and then maybe move on to another part later.
So to somebody like you who's traveled to 70 countries around the world, do you have an ambition or a goal to try and get to 100 and beyond? Is it something that's kind of a burning desire now that you've been to so many places?
I reckon I would probably hit 100, and that would be a nice number. It's not a burning target for me. That sounds like a nice even number, though. But probably more meaningful for me would be to finish Asia, because then if I ever write a book finally, then it would be kind of nice to say, if I wrote a book about Asia, for example, it'd be nice to say I've actually been to every country in Asia. And I think that would be kind of cool.
What countries are you missing on your Asia excursions at the moment?
Getting harder, Mark, because they're all, the ones that are left are pretty much all in war.
Okay.
If we take Asia being the whole Asia continent, including the Middle East, I've got Yemen left, Syria, Iraq. Iraq's relatively peaceful right now, other than internal protests, and Afghanistan. So it's getting harder. Hopefully, these places will become a little bit safer, not only for my travels, but for their own sake, of the people on the ground. And then we'll be able to hit those places. So it's just a few left.
Has safety been a thing that you've been conscious of as you've been traveling around the world over the years? Is it something that you've run up against as an issue in any particular places?
I've been pretty lucky, I think. I have been to a few places where there was some bombings going on while I was there, but not where I was. And a few places that there was some bombings that happened just before I got there. But I never had I never had much of a problem. And what I also realized was you can't take the whole country as a generality for a safety status. For example, if we say Afghanistan, it's very regional. So, well, in the case of Afghanistan, it's probably no place is green. Green is safe, and red is completely unsafe. Yeah. But there would be some orange zones, for example, that if you're a careful traveler, you know what you're doing, and you plan ahead, probably those orange zones would be okay. But even the experienced traveler, you wouldn't ever want to go to the red zones. So even within a country, if you really got to do your homework and see what's safe and what's not.
If we broke traveling down into three different aspects, let's say physical, emotional, and spiritual, what do you enjoy the most about the emotional side of traveling?
You know, if you go to the mountains of Central Asia, like Tajikistan, that's where I think that the emotional and the spiritual come together a little bit when you're out in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, and you haven't seen anybody else for at least a half a day, if not a whole day, and you really feel that connection with nature. So those are the times that it seems to evoke emotions from me when you realize just how much we've lost our connection with nature. For example, us that have grown up in an urban environment, and or just the emotional. Well, I guess will also come out if there is some sort of social issue in the place that you're at. For example, Cambodia, knowing that what had happened there not that many years before I arrived, and you're going through, for example, mass graves, those types of emotions. And sometimes I'll purposefully try to go to places to evoke those types of emotions so you can see the positives and the negatives of humanity. And so it's not just going on the beach, of course, because you're not going to get too many emotions on the beach. But if you can go to these places and feel and talk to people on the ground, that's where I think, for me, the emotions start coming out.
Yeah, that's a great response, and that's what I was leading to with my question. And I think another country that evokes a deep sense of emotional connection is when you travel in India. And I know that you've had a large stint of travel in India, and I always say to people that I would like everybody on the planet at some stage during their lifetime to go to India and visit it, because it is a unique country. It has some very confrontational, in-your-face situations that evoke a lot of emotion. Would you agree with that?
You hit it on the head, and you mentioned physical, emotional, spiritual, and maybe nowhere else on the earth will you get all three as deep as you will in India, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
Totally agree with that. It would be great for everyone to visit a place. It's a fascinating country. You could probably spend a whole year there and still have leftover places to see.
Yeah, agree. Okay, it's time for another pop quiz question for you. This one's an easy one. So, window or aisle seat, and why?
Generally, it would be window for me for a very simple reason that I like to get up a lot, and I also need to get up because my leg gets cramped very easily.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to get up and move around at will. The exception would be, of course, when you really want to see something in particular, like the Andes in Peru. And then you better be on the left side in a window seat if you want to see those mountains.
Yeah.
Other than that, I'll be in the aisle.
You're the aisle man. Okay, good answer to that question. Now, your personal motto is the best journeys are those with paths less groomed. When and where did that come from?
I think I had to write a bio years ago, and maybe that's where. Actually, probably it's from one of my quotes. One of my little things that I like to do is as ideas, maybe because I'm a writer, as ideas pop into my head, I just start writing them down. And I think that was one thing I jotted down. Then when I wrote a bio years later, I thought of using that as a personal motto.
I like it because it speaks to adventure. It speaks to getting out of your comfort zone. It speaks to going to places that we don't typically have on our travel itinerary list.
Exactly, yeah.
So of all the places you've visited so far, John, is there any one particular place that you feel more connected to? We just talked about that whole emotional, spiritual and physical presence. Is there a country where you feel it's kind of like a second home to you?
I have always felt quite comfortable going back to Shanghai, I guess, because and I also developed a lot of friends there. I could say the same thing about Seoul as well, but Shanghai, maybe because I've been going back there for 25 years, so it always feels like a bit like coming home when I go to Shanghai, as well as Bangkok, because I've also been there many times. I've got some friends, so it's a kind of place where you're not going to really sightsee because you've already done that all, and you could really just go there and hang out and be yourself, and like that second home. Of course, my mother will remind me that my real home is in New Jersey at her house. So that would be the ultimate place that feels like home.
Yeah.
As well as there are some countries that stand out for those three things that you mentioned: physical, emotional, spiritual, like India. Another one is Bhutan, which you've had a podcast on before that I listened to, on a really good podcast on your channel.
Yeah.
Those are the types of places where you really do feel that you're in a very special place that you would probably love to come back to.
So if I was to put you on the spot and say to you, give me 2 places in the world that you think my listeners must include on their bucket list before the end of their life journey, where would those 2 places be?
Yeah, as with a lot of things, it depends a little bit what you want. Some folks do love to go to the beach and just unwind. If you do like, if you like mountains and if you like nature, I would always go back to Central Asia, because places like Tajikistan, like Kazakhstan, and even Kyrgyzstan, as well as the other ones too. But for overall peace, serenity, being with nature, being able to do hikes that don't involve going up to Everest, but just reasonable hikes in places that you're also going to meet interesting people, you're going to meet different cultures. So all of it, sort of combined into one place. I think Central Asia in general is pretty awesome. We talked about Bhutan and India as being experiential places, and really even China as a whole. There's so much to see there, and you could, just like India, you could spend a year traveling in China and still not see everything. And my latest one is Peru. I think Peru also really ranks right up there as just a great overall destination.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned the stans, because A lot of people don't have the stans on their list, and as you've mentioned, there are so many incredible landscapes to be had, and the people are so amazing and generous and welcoming in that part of the world. Yet that part of Central Asia hasn't really yet taken off as far as mass tourism, has it?
It's getting maybe a little bit more now. It's starting to get a little visibility, and perhaps within Asia now, because people are starting. It's getting on the map, but still very under-traveled.
A seasoned traveller like yourself is pretty adept when it comes to negotiating your way through airports and all the other side parts and peripheral activities around travel. What's the biggest hassle for you though when you're traveling these days? What do you find is the thing that you kind of dread the most about traveling?
Probably like a lot of people, the whole airplane experience with security and everything, and just the waiting. Um, that's the only thing I don't probably look forward to too much. Plus, like the thing with my legs, stiffening up. So long journeys, and then it's often cold for me on the airplane. So it's not something I look forward to is flying. On the other hand, you can bring a nice book and then catch up on some movies, since I don't go to the cinemas much in Singapore because they are so cold, like you mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I go home to New York, I can catch 3 or 4 movies I never saw before.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's quite a good timing that you mentioned airlines there, because your next pop quiz question is related to airlines. So I'm going to get
Okay.
you to choose between one of these two airlines as your favorite: Singapore Airlines or Emirates.
I'd probably choose Singapore Airlines as a proud resident of Singapore.
Very
And
diplomatic.
overall, I think overall they're top notch. They do everything well. I'm a little bit more maybe partial to the Eastern Asian carriers because I'm used to it. I've been in East Asia for 20 years now, so I'd probably choose Singapore.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer. Now, social, economic, and environmental sustainability development is one of your many passions. What do you think about the impacts on all of these elements that we have when we travel to foreign countries? Because as tourists, we have a growing responsibility, both from a social and economic and an environmental sustainability point of view. And I'm interested to get your views on this, because are we being as responsible as we could be when we travel, and what can we do better, do you think?
That's a great question. I just went to a sustainable tourism conference in Singapore just a few weeks ago. That would be a conference that you would have never heard anybody doing just a few years ago. And I just attend out of interest. It wasn't too expensive. And Marina Bay Sands Hotel sponsored it. So the price of the conference wasn't so high because the hotel conference center that it was hosted in actually provided the venue for free.
Mm.
So some of the hotels are now taking sustainable tourism seriously when it comes to energy use, food wastage. Tour companies are starting to realize they play a part. Even Visa, the credit card, they had a speaker from Visa. They were talking about how, from their standpoint, that's also important because if people are not traveling sustainably, that affects their business in one way or another. So just the fact that this is starting to happen now, long way to go. And there is a burgeoning, sort of sustainable, not only sustainable tourism, but sustainable travel, like you mentioned. And it's a topic that I'd like to write at least one article, if not a series of articles on sustainable travel. What does that mean? And as I did a little bit of research on that, it's starting to become a topic that is gaining ground. And what is our sort of responsibility as individual travelers? I'm as far as carbon footprint, we're all pretty guilty because we take airplanes. So right off the bat, someone like me is not doing very well with, from a pure carbon standpoint. But looking at the whole spectrum of energy usage, which affects carbon output, but also our impact on the cultures and the peoples in the places that we visit. How do we make either do no harm, or even better would be to actually help out the local communities in ways that we don't even know how to do yet. But as this topic gets more traction, I think people will start to realize, hey, I can, maybe instead of going to Machu Picchu where everyone goes, that maybe I can go to this other place and help develop the local tourism market there, which will also help out the local communities. So there's a lot of things we can do.
I think it's a very exciting part of the landscape, really, because we're probably just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the way that technology is going to impact the way that we travel in the future. And I guess if you look at the supply chains within travel, you've got everybody from the manufacturers of aircraft who are going through massive re-engineering and innovation within their sector, and who knows how long it'll be before we're all flying around in electric aircraft and all those sorts of things. So I think there's a responsibility across the entire supply chain when it comes to sustainability and looking at how we all play a role in that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, very much. I think technologically, the jet engine hasn't progressed a whole lot, and it's it's just inefficient. So that's a big part of the answer. And other things could be different ways of moving around, like maybe getting to someplace by train instead of a plane. And by someone like me writing about that experience, go to Sukhothai, which was the old capital of Thailand way before Bangkok. Instead of flying there, maybe take a train. And by the way, it's actually pretty fun, And here's what happened to me on the train. So you're actually encouraging people to take alternative transport as well.
Do you travel more responsibly, in inverted brackets, versus how you did 20 years ago?
I don't think so. I think because of the destinations I've been tending to choose, I think my footprint, especially going back to the carbon footprint, is still pretty bad. I have, maybe taken cars and trains more than I used to, but it's definitely something I could do better, or at least maybe put some countries together in one trip to reduce the carbon footprint. That is something I'm trying to do.
Okay, good. Well, it's an area that we can all take on a greater responsibility for the sake of ourselves, our future generations, and our planet, of course. Now, moving on back to some of the destinations you've been to, because I know that a lot of my listeners will be hungry to hear some of the more exotic places that you visited. Tell us about Mongolia. What were your impressions of going to Mongolia for the first time?
Mongolia was really awesome. I was living in Korea at the time, and it wasn't tremendously far. And to get there, I went through Beijing. In the capital, Ulaanbaatar, there was a tremendous sandstorm, which is not unusual for them at all. So the plane from Beijing to Ulaanbaatar got delayed, then it got delayed again, then it got delayed again, and then finally they canceled it. So there was a whole group of us to take that trip. We were all stranded together. The airline did put us up in a hotel way on the outskirts of Beijing somewhere, and we made the most of it. We had good fun. We drank together, we ate together. And this was this was at least 10 years ago now. I still keep in touch with some of those people, believe it or not. And we meet every once in a while in the New York and DC area. But once we finally got there, then I went our separate ways, and I decided to go to where Genghis Khan's original palace was, which there's almost nothing left now except for some archaeological remnants of his old palace, because they didn't really build too much back then. But just going to where, to kind of where it all started, and actually having your feet on the soil of where his the great Mongolian horde started from. That was pretty incredible, and that's quite a ways away from the capital. So it was an adventure getting there, and it was also an adventure getting back. I slept at least one night in a gur in a tent, traditional tent, which I think everyone should do. That's another thing everyone should do once in their lives.
Add it to the list. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, spend the night in a yurt or a gur, depending on the country you're in, but the default tent, and that's a great experience.
So, as far as someone listening to the show who's thinking about Mongolia, what's the main takeaway from going to a place like Mongolia for you?
A bit like I had mentioned about the Central Asia, kind of between the openness, the beauty, the nature, really feeling like you're reconnecting with the earth, and wildlife. Of course, as you get outside of the main cities, and that openness that you almost would never feel if you're hanging out in a city most of the time, like most of us do. So to me, that's the magic of Mongolia. And then you've also have the places like Mongolia and Bhutan, and Tibet, for example, that spirituality that also comes into play.
Yep.
Because they tend to be highly Buddhist places. And so being able to go to a temple and see people as they pray, and then the incense and the horns blowing, it all kind of comes together to make a very rich experience for a traveler to see something that they don't normally see.
Yeah, that's great. Now, another destination that you have on your list of achievements is Siberia. Not a lot of people have gone to Siberia for very obvious reasons, I think, but can you talk us through your experience in Siberia?
That was another really good trip. Like a lot of people do take Siberian Railway if they do, manage to get there. And that was, I honestly took a relatively easy way, and I only took about half the railway, because it is pretty long. So you have to be on the train for at least 7 days. From the eastern end is Vladivostok, all the way in the Russian Far East, all the way to Moscow. So you're actually transgressing the European and Asian continents. So I went from Vladivostok to Irkutsk, actually probably about a third of the way.
Kilometers are we talking about in that distance?
Well, to put it in one way of looking at it, it was like roughly 3 full days on the train.
Okay.
So quite a long distance. And I don't know how many kilometers that would be, but quite long. So you can imagine if you went the whole way, how much that's even more. So you're hitting, I'm actually just looking at a map right now that's up on my wall. You're hitting, roughly half of the Russian Far East, which is a tremendous territory. And, but the stops along the way. So if anybody would take the railway, I would always recommend to spend at least day trips as you get off the train, and maybe even some overnights. And there are some cities along the way that are I found actually astonishing that they were so big. Some cities that had 500,000 people. So you think Siberia? How could this city be here in Siberia? Siberia is not like the stereotype. Going back to stomping out stereotypes, and Siberia is a perfect example where it's not barren. like it kind of just sounds, because the railway, hits the southern part of Siberia, or if you take the whole Russian Asia or the Russian Far East, it's all along the south part. So if you really want to go into the barren lands and really get lost, you'd have to go north from the Trans Siberian Railway. Yes, but and they have trains that come off of the Trans Siberian Railway. They have local trains that I didn't take, but I've met some people that were really adventurous, and they would go off on these local trains that would run north-south, for example, and go up into these really desolate places. They would still have towns and small cities, but that would be a real adventure to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I think I'm going to put Siberia on my 2020 bucket list.
It's maybe we can. Well, I'll finish the part that I didn't hit so far with you.
Yeah, let's do it, and you can do some writing about it, and I'll do a podcast show or two from up there as well.
Yeah, it'd be a Siberian podcast.
Don't know how many are out there. John, we've rushed through our time together today. It's been extraordinarily interesting. I'd love to have you back on the show in 2020 if you're game to come back and do a second podcast show with me at some stage.
I would love it. It'd be my honor, and especially if everyone out there listening is getting some value from it, then I'm happy to do that.
Well, we've only just touched the surface of a lot of amazing places that you've traveled to throughout your life, and I'm sure you've given plenty of insight and inspiration to my listeners today, and let's hope they go and book a ticket to one of these places that you've talked about and go and experience it for themselves, because that's what this show is all about.
Absolutely.
Quickly, before I let you go, what are your plans for Christmas? Are you heading back to the United States, or what's planned?
Yes, I've been overseas for, I think, 20 years now, and I've never missed a Christmas at home. So I'm a pretty filial son.
Well, you'll be able to wrap up this podcast episode and share it with your family because you dedicated it to them, and enjoy it around the Christmas fireplace.
That sounds great. What a great Christmas present.
Yeah, you can just sit down and talk, and someone else records it for you. That's a beautiful gift.
That's right. And my gift to my family is your podcast.
Wonderful stuff. Well, listen, it's been fantastic having you on the show. Thank you once again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to accommodate me. I appreciate it. Have a very Merry Christmas, a safe trip back to the US, and we'll definitely get you back on the show next year as well.
Thank you very much, Mark, and everyone for having me. Merry Christmas and best wishes for 2020.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree that was a fantastic episode with John Hamalian about all his travel exploits so far, and still plenty more to come as well. If you're looking for more episodes from the Global Travel Channel podcast show, don't forget to go to our website at www.globaltravelchannel.com. You'll find all of our previous episodes there. You can download them from Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and a host of other locations. They're all listed there on our website. Don't forget, if you like our content, share it with family, friends, and work colleagues. The more people we can get listening to our podcast show, the better. Okay, well, that's it for this particular episode. My name is Mark Philpott. Until next time, I wish you all bon voyage.